Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be continuing our six-part series on the Wives of Henry VIII. Today we're going to look at wife number 2, Anne Boleyn. And we think about Anne Boleyn, Chris, she is probably one of the most famous queens in British history. Yet she's only in power or on the throne, so to speak, for 3 years. So this is a woman who was in a position of power only very briefly, but the impact she had in multiple ways, as we're going to talk about today, was quite great.
Yeah, one of the most famous, but probably also one of the most divisive as well. And, when you think about her story as it relates to history, it basically centers around lust, love, scandal, and murder. And yet her long-lasting achievements to English history, which makes its way over to America, is one of those just fascinating stories about history, because here's a woman, who, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but is one who simply loses her head. And before she loses her head physically, there's a lot of historical relevance to suggest that she was trying to compete with the king as far as her power and her desires. And it eventually caught up to her because, Ray, in Henry's eyes, she couldn't do the one thing that he needed her to do. And that was carry on the dynasty, fulfill the mission of having a son. And that will play a heavy role in what happens in her life under this 3-year tenure as queen, but also before then, and even her legacy afterwards.
Yeah, and you talk about her relationship with America. It's under her reign as queen. I mean, under her daughter's reign. The irony of it is, Henry VIII wanted a son. He wanted an heir. And little did he know his second child, Elizabeth, who he had with Anne Boleyn, would be Queen of England for how many years was she queen? Elizabeth I.
For a period of time. And yet she was the queen who never should have been queen, right? Because he banished her and didn't want her to have anything to do with the kingdom. And yet, joke's on him.
Yeah, and it was under her reign, Elizabeth I's reign, that America, the lost colony, the adventure there at Roanoke. So anyway, we've gotten way ahead of ourselves here, Chris. Anne Boleyn was born in Norfolk, England, probably, depending on who you read, 1502, 1501, somewhere along in that ballpark. There have been some people who've argued for a slightly later date of her birth, but she's born very early, within the first 10 years of the 16th century. She's born to Sir Thomas Boleyn and his wife, Elizabeth Howard Boleyn. And he was a London merchant. And of course, he's trying to get ahead in life. And they have 3 children. They have Elizabeth, they have Mary, and they have George. At least those are the surviving children that they have. And interestingly enough, we don't know their birth dates. We don't even know Anne's exact birth year, but we certainly don't know their birth dates. We know, however, they do seem to be close in age.
Yeah, they're close in age, but the other thing we have to invite our listeners to go back and listen to episode 1, which was focusing on Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII is a player, and one of the interesting things about Anne is that she plays such an important part of English history, as you mentioned, but we don't know much about her. But what has been stated is that Anne really was not one of the prettiest women in the world. She's considered to be moderately pretty. I'd be very careful about how we say this, but back then, Henry had specific things that he was looking for. And if we are looking back at history, we might be asking ourselves, well, she really doesn't quite meet those
Yeah.
qualifications?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who said, usually critics of hers, she apparently had a large mole on this one side of her neck, and there's some speculation, I don't know how true it was, it came from the time that she had an extra finger on her left hand. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those mysteries, but it's about 90% false, but it makes for a great story. And you have to ask yourself, I mean, come on, if she's not the most prettiest in the world, do you really think that this Henry VIII, who is by all means can have anybody that he wants in his reign, is he really going to want to choose someone who has these features that doesn't kind of match up, right, with kind of who Henry VIII is? However, regardless of that, she will attract his attention, and she's also very coy at the way that she does this. And I don't want to get ahead of it because we've got to get her there first. But, she actually was pledged to be married to another man. And that didn't quite work out as planned because some people got involved in it.
Yeah, she was really, in some ways, I think she was sort of Henry VIII's second choice. Well, third choice if you count Catherine of Aragon, who we talked about in the previous episode, but she was his second choice here, in that her sister Mary was sort of the one he was sort of, I guess you could say, smitten with. But it would be Anne Boleyn that would ultimately end up grabbing him, so to speak. But it's interesting, she was well educated. This is a well-educated woman. She had a French education. She, by everything we know, she was, had good intellect. She could sing, she could dance, the whole 9 yards. So she had a toolbox to bring with her to the relationship with Henry VIII.
Yeah, and the I guess kind of going back before she gets there is that Anne Boleyn was scheduled, if you will, to be married to another individual. However, the cardinal, the Catholic cardinal, if you will, did not approve of that marriage, did not think that it was really good. And basically what's happened is she's kind of forced to head back home. And I'm sure there was a lot of embarrassment with it, and some other feelings as well. She does begin an affair with a very rich person. And this is kind of why this is why Anne, I think, starts to have such a bitter taste for Catholicism, and that plays a lot later on in life, is because she felt that these priests and these high cardinals were very political, and it impacted who she could be in love with, who she could have a relationship with. And I think that at an early age, the distaste for Catholicism will kind of lead her to really, she's a very religious person, very religious, kind of leads her into a different direction.
Yeah. Now, let's talk real quick about how she got into a position where maybe she would have been noticed by King Henry VIII. Remember from our last episode on Catherine of Aragon, Catherine is queen. And of course, if our listeners remember, even though Henry divorces Catherine, or at least has the marriage annulled, just sort of dismissed, Catherine is going to live out the rest of her days claiming to still be queen. She's never going to really willingly let go of that title. But it's during Catherine of Aragon's reign as queen that Anne Boleyn is brought into the court to serve Catherine of Aragon. And while she is there, and we mentioned a few minutes ago, she wasn't necessarily going to attract a lot of men through her physical appearance, allegedly, but she was very popular there among the young men, I think because of her personality, her wit, her intelligence. So she was very popular. And Chris, just to sort of follow up on something I think you alluded to, I think she was probably a good-looking lady. Maybe she just didn't fit some standards that they had at the time, because she was very popular with the young men there in the court. And of course, she apparently, when it came to getting attention, she could flirt with the best of them. She was very flirtatious. She knew how to. I think she probably had a very bubbly personality. She knew how to get around people with power, whether it was Catherine or even, subsequently Henry. So this is a lady who, even though she's known as one of Henry VIII's wives, this is a woman who could stand on her own quite easily without Catherine and without Henry.
It's a great point by saying could stand on her own, because while she's in court, serving as, an attendant to Catherine, Henry has his eyes on her and begins to seduce her. And
she plays hard to get.
Well, and that's the thing, that who can, once again, I hate to say this, but he is king. And during that time, he had tons of mistresses. He had all those things. He could have anybody that he wanted. But, Anne basically tells King Henry, I am not going to be your mistress, and denies her sexual relations and sexual favors before they get married. And I'm pretty sure that it was Anne who said, if you want me, marry me. That's basically how this is going to be. And it was, I'm going to be queen, or there's going to be nothing between us, your choice. And I think some of that honestly goes to, as you mentioned earlier, that Henry had used her sister Mary years before, that Mary had been a mistress to Henry. And here's Anne, who had seen that. And she was like, this is wrong, using her religious upbringing, her religious background, things of that nature. And so, she said, I'm not going to be your mistress. If you want to marry me, that's one thing. I'm happy to be queen, and I can be, see this as something that we can have. And that is when Henry begins to really work hard to make his annulment happen with Catherine, his first wife, so that he can have Anne. And I'm surprised by this, if and that's why I think it's great we're doing this series on these wives, because you then look at Henry VIII, who basically could have said, forget you, Anne, I'm going to go to somebody else. I'll just go to the next one that's in line. But you can see King Henry's passion for Anne. You can go and actually look at the love letters that he writes to her when she is away or when she's doing things. I mean, Henry hated to write letters, and very few documents survive of anything that he actually wrote. But he wrote 17 love letters to her. And in those love letters, you have this king pouring out his heart. And it's more than just trying to get her in bed. He truly demonstrates love for her. And that carries some weight with Henry. And so he really starts to try to have that relationship with Anne, which comes after the annulment with Catherine.
Yeah. And, when Anne and when Henry VIII starts sort of pursuing Anne, I think we sort of alluded to this already. She's already in a quote unquote relationship with a guy called Henry Percy. And so what the king does, what Henry VIII does, because of his attraction to Anne Boleyn, whether it was genuine love or whether it was he couldn't have her, she was that thing right out of his grasp, he gets one of his ministers, Thomas Wolsey, to actually end the relationship between Anne and Henry, so that he has a clear shot, so to speak, at Anne. And even that didn't work. And he ends up sending Anne Boleyn away into the countryside for a little while, hoping, I guess, that the old absence makes the heart grow fonder type of thing would work. And I don't think it did. I think
No,
she was still, she was still going to play that hard to get. I think he was, at this point, he was sort of pursuing it, and she was, playing the long game, I think you could say.
it was a long game, but it was also a short game
Yeah.
because she was ready to be queen. She saw, I mean, we have to just, she is an active player in this. And it is known that Anne had a famous temper, and she also had a pretty strong tongue. And there were recollections of very famous arguments between Henry and Anne. That everybody heard, I mean, in a room or somewhere. I mean, they heard Henry. He's very boisterous as it is, but Anne also would fight back. She didn't hold back, and you have to say, look, Anne is kind of holding out now. She's already lost, had one marriage not happen because of some issues, and here's another, and she's thinking, what happens if Henry doesn't get an annulment with Catherine? All this work that I've done, I've wasted time. I could have enjoyed my life with that rich heir, Piercy, that I could have been dealing with. And so, I think we start to see that she is pushing Henry, which also leads the people of England to not really like Anne Boleyn.
Yeah.
They don't like her. I mean, because they see that she's that vicious woman in the middle who is destroying this perfect relationship between Catherine and Henry VIII. And so they're basically calling on her. They're calling her all sorts of names. And I don't know the English word. Pake, I think, is what it is, but it's basically a prostitute. They called her a whore. They called her, I mean, all of these things they're calling her, because you basically see Henry VIII giving more titles, more responsibilities to Anne, kicking Catherine to the side. And, the people of England don't like it, and they blame Anne for all their troubles.
Yeah, like you said, they blame Anne for everything. If the king, Henry VIII, did something unpopular, it was Anne's fault. She sort of became the scapegoat for everything Henry did that nobody liked. Now, last episode, Chris, in our episode on Catherine of Aragon, we talked about Henry's divorce from Catherine. And if we remember from our previous episode, Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, was the aunt of Charles V, who's the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So you've got a woman here in Catherine of Aragon who was very well connected. So Henry VIII goes to the Pope and requests this divorce. Of course, he doesn't go personally. He sends his representative and requests this divorce. The Pope denies it. So what does Henry do? Henry withdraws the entire nation of England, the Church of England, from the Roman Catholic Church. He places himself at the head of the church so that he can marry Anne Boleyn. But we got a problem. It is likely, according to people who study this more than I do, that there had already been some sort of private wedding between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Of course, the formal marriage wouldn't happen until January of 1533. And of course, Elizabeth would be born in September of 1533. So there's some indication that maybe he had already moved to marry Anne secretly, even before everything was sort of said and done. And of course, he's going to claim, if you remember from last episode, he's going to claim that Elizabeth and him were, what was it? They were married to, she had married his brother who had died, and therefore the whole thing was invalid. And he's going to marry Anne. And of course, he's going to later accuse her of witchcraft and all this other stuff. And so he just sort of, he gets in love with someone, they don't do what he wants, and he just reverses course and pretends like everything that he said before didn't happen.
Yeah, and it's at this point when, they finally get what they wanted after 7 long years of waiting for Henry's divorce. Here we go. We're finally the power couple that is going to be. And yet what's going to happen is a series of heartaches that's going to take place. But as you mentioned, they get married. It's not September is coming very fast, in which she is pregnant, and everybody is confident. I mean, there's probably like 99.9% that this child that Anne is carrying is going to be a boy. They are making preparations. Names are being chosen. Edward and Henry are the top choices, and they've already written out the proclamation of the birth, and they have written in that Prince has been born. I mean, all of the plans have been made, and Anne, she is put on bed rest, kind of in preparation to have the child. And the baby comes on September the 7th. And oh my goodness, they have to go.
Boy.
And they literally have to go into all of these proclamations, and they put an extra S in there, because it was Prince and now it's Princess, and they've got to change all this. You didn't have whiteout back then. You didn't have Grammarly or anything like that. You just delete and put Princess, instead of Prince. But they had to do all of these things, and the Christian in service is scaled down. All of these things are done, and Elizabeth is born. And once again, just like Catherine of Aragon, this is great. This is okay. I mean, Henry is extremely disappointed. He was really needing this son, but he says, okay, there's going to be another opportunity. There's going to be another chance. But Anne, recognizes that she's got to bear a son, and she's got to bear a son pretty quick. And amazingly, by January, she's pregnant again.
Yeah, and the situation once Elizabeth's born is not good. I mean, this is dysfunctional. You look at the royal family today, and there's a little drama. It was drama back then too. We've already talked about some of it. But Elizabeth's born, and all of a sudden Mary, if we remember, who's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, is now second place. And she is, of course, being told she has to show respect to the new queen and all this, because now Elizabeth is lifted up to be the princess. She's the star child, and Mary isn't anymore. In fact, when they would visit Elizabeth, when Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn would visit Elizabeth, Mary was kept in a separate part of the building so that they would not be together. I mean, so they sort of push Mary out of the picture, lift Elizabeth up on a stool. So, this is just not creating a good family atmosphere. And as you mentioned, Anne's going to be pregnant again. She's going to miscarriage, twice?
Yeah, she has multiple miscarriages, even up until 1536. And there's a lot that happens. There's this constant struggle. I mean, she really, truly, she wants a son for herself, but she just wants this. I think she kind of knew the history here, right? I mean, she starts to see, think about, as you mentioned, what they did with Mary, what they do. And she is really working hard on this. I do think it's interesting that there's a story that takes place. It's a little bit later in the process. But I think it was January 1536. Henry almost died. And they were having this, they would have these jousting tournaments, where you would suit up, you would have armor, the person would have armor and the horse would be armored, and you would take these jousts and you would kind of charge each other and you try to knock somebody off the horse. And King Henry enjoyed that, and he would do that. And there was a day in which you weren't supposed to touch the king, like you were always supposed to lose. Mm-hmm. But Henry was dressed in armor. The horse was dressed in armor, and he got thrown off the horse, and he fell down, and the horse fell on top of him, and it left him unconscious for over 2 hours. And many people thought Henry VIII was dead. They thought that he wasn't going to make it. But many people now believe that he suffered a TBI, a traumatic brain injury, from this, and that he would never be the same, which is kind of, if you study the life of Henry VIII at this point, he just starts acting out of his head. But what happened is that Anne felt so grieved that Henry was on death's bed. She was pregnant at the time. And the accident of Henry caused her to miscarry. And many people believe that child was actually a boy, and that if the accident hadn't happened, that they would have had a son.
I believe in that situation, the baby was far enough along that when it was stillborn, it was a boy.
Yeah.
But Henry, around this time, he enjoyed sports. He was you talked about the jousting, which he clearly enjoyed. He enjoyed other sports. He's sort of athletic in his 20s and 30s. But once he enters his 40s, this all starts to change. He starts suffering from various health issues. He starts to put on weight to the point where he's obese. People have certainly seen the artistic renderings, the drawings of Henry VIII, where he's this very large guy, and that starts being what they're seeing. He's gaining weight. He's less and less healthy. He's obese. He does have a mistress, I believe, during this time as well. She does not conceive. So there's some speculation about his virility during this time. But he's not healthy. Despite all of that, though, when Anne doesn't give birth to a male, or when she miscarriages, instead of saying, well, it just wasn't meant to be, he blames her. And so, all the weight, all the blame for everything is on her shoulders for not bearing a son. And that's ultimately going to be and all this is going to come together to be sort of the snowball that ends up, crushing her.
Yeah, because he's embarrassed with everything that's going on, and a king is not going to take the blame. A king is not going to say, well, it's me. And of course, his eye is wandering already to number 3 that is in the list. And so he needs to find an escape. He needs to get out of this. And he can't use what he used with Catherine, because he already used it. And if he it's just not going to happen again. He's not going to get the support from the Catholic Church to annul this again the way that he did it last time. It's just not going to work, because can't use the brother. So what he does in this moment is he is going to accuse her of like 3 separate crimes. And it's not just some like simple thing. This is huge. And the first thing, and probably the most well-known of her crimes, and I'll just mention them, we can talk about them real quick. The first one is adultery, and then you've got conspiracy / witchcraft that's going to come into this. But the most well-known is that Henry VIII, the gall of him, goes after and says that Anne is guilty of adultery, that she's been sleeping around on the king, and not just with one, but she's been sleeping around with a Swedish musician. She's been sleeping around with the king's attendant. She's sleeping around with a poet. She's got like all of these people that she's sleeping around with. And all of them are saying, we didn't do it. We didn't do it. We didn't do it. But a jury created by the king finds these individuals guilty, along with Anne, of being guilty of adultery. And Ray, one of the most hard to believe things in all of this is that one of the jury members that presides over this case was a man whose name was Thomas Boleyn. Anne's father found his own daughter guilty of being an adulteress. And she is sent to the well-known Tower of London, if you will. And while there, she starts to have these conversations, if you will. I don't know if she's like role playing or she's having this drama that's basically recounting conversations and flirtations with various members. And what she didn't know is that people in the Tower of London, the guards, would actually go and tell the king, this is what your wife's saying. So,
Yeah.
she's, and when she said these things in the Tower of London, that led to the second crime, which is treason.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you mentioned a minute ago the hypocrisy of Henry VIII, because he already was having an affair with others, but even with Anne Boleyn's sister, Mary, right? By this particular point.
And not just her sister, but there's also evidence that he slept with Anne's mom.
Yeah.
Now he says, I would never sleep with her mom, but
I sleep with her sister, but not her mom. At least he had morals. But yeah, he pushed it. She was sentenced to death. And Chris, when it came time to execute her by beheading, they brought in, and I find this fascinating, they didn't just hire some dude off the street with an axe. They imported this guy from France, a professional axeman, a professional beheader. They imported him from France. So this is going to be done, and it's going to be done right. So May 19, 1536, she is to be executed. And I believe it was in public. I know it was in public.
Yeah.
It wasn't private. And she gives this speech. I guess before they were executed, they were allowed to, say some words. And she gives this speech. And she says, I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. And to me, he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign Lord. End quote. So she's getting ready to be executed, beheaded by the king. Well, not by him personally, but, he's ordered her execution. Yet, she calls him a merciful and gentle sovereign Lord. I find that fascinating.
It's especially fascinating when he accuses her of adultery.
Yeah.
And one other thing I failed to mention about the adultery, if I can, that the last of the men that was arrested and accused of having committed adultery with Anne was George Boleyn, Anne's brother. He even raised up that she was sleeping with her brother, which is why he led to the third crime, which was that she was a witch. All of this idea of witchcraft and things of that nature. And if you think about that, here's this great and graceful king, and he is calling for her death. But Ray, one of the things that has just been recently uncovered, which is why you always study history, you're always learning something, is that they just recently found details of King Henry VIII and his, I guess, fascination with Anne's death. He had it written down to the bullet point of how he wanted it done. As you mentioned, they brought in this Frenchman. And the reason they brought him in is because beheadings, there was a story of one lady, they had to try 10 times to get her head off, and so this guy was very, very skilled. But really, her death sentence, if you follow the English law at the time, is she was supposed to have been burned at the stake.
Yeah.
That was the original thing. But he's, you have to understand, it's the first time that a queen has ever been killed. And, Henry VIII, looking after himself, was like, dude, I'm not going to burn a queen at the stake. I have, as you mentioned, I have morals. We'll cut her head off. And I'm going to hire the most expensive guy who's got a really sharp sword. I mean, he's not going to be an axe. I mean, the guy knows what he's doing. So I have compassion for her. I have sympathy. I'm going to take care of her. And that, that day he's looking out the window, listening for the cannons, which signaled her death, that it had happened. But you look at all of these things that take place, is he wanted that swift execution of her, because I do think he loved her. And I think with him, it was all about his legacy, all about who he was and what he does. And that's why it's important to study these wives. Here's a human being who, even after going through all of this, at the very end of her life, she said, don't judge him. Mm-hmm. And don't talk about him. I read that whole speech. It's really fascinating reading that whole speech, but somewhere in there, she says, it's my time to go. And we all have a time to go. It's that time. I don't remember exactly what it was. But man, can you just, imagine that? Gosh. And, there were some illustrations that they buried her head in one place because the king wanted to go and visit it, I think, or something like that.
Yeah. I remember something to that extent. Sort of moving away from the execution, young Elizabeth, she's almost 4 years old at this particular point in time. Henry has already got his eyes on somebody else. And remember, who was Anne Boleyn? She served in the court of Catherine Aragon. And his next wife, or maybe we call her victim, was a lady by the name of Jane Seymour, who was a lady in waiting for Anne Boleyn. So he starts right back over where he did before.
But Elizabeth, who would go on to probably have the greatest reign in the entire English kingdom, if you will, and was all as a result of Anne Boleyn, and also Mary. We can't forget about Mary, because Mary of Catherine of Aragon was Mary, Queen of Scots. And you've got, if our listeners, you've got Mary was Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth was known as the Virgin Queen. And so our listeners might say, "Oh yeah, okay, I remember that." So they have a very prominent role in history, when Henry VIII was adamant that neither one of them ever assumed the throne.
Yeah. And, he does have a son, as we're going to talk about later in this series. He does have a son named Edward, and Edward becomes king as a boy, but he doesn't ever live to maturity. He dies of tuberculosis. So anyway, great episode, Chris. I hope our listeners enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for our next episode, which will be on, oh my gosh, I forgot her name. Jane Seymour. There you go. Thank you. That will be on Jane Seymour, and we'll just keep going through these wives. 2 down, Chris, and 4 more to go.
Yeah, we're going to see more of these ex-wives of Henry VIII.
Yeah, we will see more of Jane Seymour. All right. Hope our listeners enjoyed this episode. Please share this podcast with your family and friends.